Hello and welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with Misery. Chapter 22. But for a long time no sleep came. He floated on the dope and thought about the situation he was in. It seemed a little easier now. It was easier to think about the book which he had cremated and then uncreated. Isolated things like pieces of cloth which may be pieced together to make a quilt. They were miles from the neighbors who, Annie said, didn't like her. What was the name? Boynton? No, Roydman. That was it, Roydman. And how far away from town? Not too far, surely. He was in a circle whose diameter might be as small as 15 miles or as large as 45. Annie Wilkes' house was in the circle, and the Rodmans and downtown Sidewinder, however pitiful small that might be. And my Camaro, somewhere in that circle. Did the police find it? He thought not. He was a well-known person. If a car had been found tags registered in his name, a little elementary checking would have shown he had been in Boulder and then had dropped out of sight. The discovery of his wrecked and empty car would have prompted a search stories on the news. She never watches the news on TV, never listens to the radio at all. Unless she's got one with an earplug or phones. It was all a little like the dog in the Sherlock Holmes story, the one that didn't bark. His car hadn't been found because the cops hadn't come. If it had been found, they would have checked everyone in the hypothetical circle, wouldn't they? And just how many people could be there in such a circle here come close to the top of the western slope? The Rodmans, Annie Wilkes, maybe 10 or 12 others. And just because it hadn't been found so far didn't mean it wouldn't be found. His vivid imagination, which he had not gotten from anyone on his mother's side of the family, now took over. The cop was tall, handsome in a cold way, his sideburns perhaps a little bit longer than regulation. He was wearing dark sunglasses in which the person being questioned would see his own face and duplicate. His voice had a flat Midwestern twang. We found an overturned car halfway down Humbuggy Mountain, which belongs to a famous writer, Paul Sheldon. There's some blood on the seats and the dashboard, but no signs of him. Must have crawled out. Maybe it wandered away in a daze. That was a laugh, considering the state of his legs, so of course they would not have known what injuries he might have sustained. That would only assume that, if he had not been there, he must not have been strong enough to get at least a little way. The course of their deduction was not leap to such an unlikely possibility as kidnapping, at least not at first and probably never. Do you remember seeing one on the road the day of the storm? Tall man, 42 years old, sandy hair, probably wearing blue jeans and a checked flannel shirt and a parka. Might have looked some sort of bunged up. Hell, might not even know who he was. Annie would be given a cup of coffee in the kitchen. Annie would be mindful that all the doors there and the spare bedrooms would be closed. In a case he should be grown. Why no, officer, I don't see a soul. In fact, I came back from town just as quickly as I would chase Tony Roberts. He told me the bald man wasn't turning south after all. The cop, sitting down on the coffee cup and getting up. Well, if we fits anyone who sees the description, man, I hope you'll get in touch with us as fast as you can. He's quite a famous person. Been in People magazine. Some other ones, too. I certainly will, officer. And away he would go. Maybe something like that had already happened. He just didn't know it. Maybe his imaginary cop actual counterpart or counterparts had visited Annie while he was doped out. God knew he had spent time enough doped out. More thought convinced him that it was unlikely. He wasn't Joe Blow from Kokomo, just some transient blowing through. He'd been the People first bestseller, and Us first divorce. There had been a question about him one Sunday in Walter Scott's personality check. There would have been rechecks, maybe by phone, probably by the cops themselves. When a celebrity, even a quasi-celebrity like a writer, disappeared, the heat came on. You're only guessing, man. Maybe guessing, maybe deducing. Either way, it was better than just lying here doing nothing. What about guardrails. He tried and he couldn't. He either could only remember reaching for his cigarettes and then the amazing way the ground and the sky had switched places and then darkness. But again, deduction, or educated guesswork if you wanted to be snotty, made it easier to believe there had been none. Smashed guardrails and snapped guy riders would have been alerted news. So what exactly had happened? He had lost control at a place where there wasn't much of a drop. That was what, just enough grace to allow the car to flip out in space. If the drop had been steeper, there would have been more guardrails. If the drop had been steeper, Andy Wilkes would have found it difficult or impossible to get to him, let alone drag him back to the road by himself. So where was his car? Buried in snow, of course. Paul put his arm around his eyes and saw a town plow coming up a road where he was crashed only 2 hours earlier. The plow was a dim orange blob in the driving snow near the end of the day. The man driving is bundled to his eyes. On the head he was wearing an old-fashioned tradesman's cap of blue and white pillow tick. To his right, at the bottom of the shallow shape, which will, not far from here, deep in the more typical up-country gorge, lies Paul Sheldon's Camaro, with the faded blue Heart for President sticker on the rear bumper, just about the brightest thing down there. The guy driving the plow doesn't see the car. Bumper sticker is too faded to catch his eye. The wing plows block most of his side vision. Besides, it's almost dark and he's beat. Just wanted to finish his last one so he can turn the plow over to his relief and get a nice hot cup of joe. He sweeps past the plow, spewing cloudy snow into the gully. The Camaro, already drifted to the window, is now buried to the roof line. Later, in the deepest part of a stormy twilight, when even things directly in front of you look unreal, the second shift man drives by, headed in the opposite direction, and entombs it. Paul opened his eyes and looked at the plaster ceiling. There was a fine series of hairlines cracked up. There seemed to make it look like a trio of interlocked W's. He had become very familiar with them over the endless run of days he had lain there since coming out of the cloud. And now he traced them back again, either thinking other words such as wicked and wretched and witch-like and wriggling. Yes, could have been that way, could have been. Had she thought of what would happen when his car was found? She might have. She was nuts, but being nuts didn't make her stupid. Yes, it never crossed her mind that he might have a duplicate of fast cars. Yeah, and she was right. The bitch was right. I didn't. Instead of the blackened images floating up, the flames, the sounds, the smell of the uncreation, he gritted his teeth against the images and tried to shut his mind away from them. Vivid was not always good. No, you didn't, but 9 out of 10 writers would have. At least they would have. They were getting paid as much as you've been for the non-misery books. She never even thought of it. She's not a writer. Neither is she stupid, as I think we both agreed. I think she is filled with herself, as she does not have a large ego, but one is positively grandiose. Burning her, it seemed like the proper thing to do, and the idea that her concept of the proper thing to do might be shortcutted, served by something so piddling as a bank Xerox machine and a couple rolls of quarters. That would just never cross her screen, my friend. His other deductions might be like houses built on quicksand, but his view of Andy Wilkes seemed to him as solid as the rock of Gibraltar. Because of his researches for misery, he had rather more than a layman's understanding of neurosis and psychosis, and knew that although a borderline psychotic might have alternating periods of deep depression and almost suggested cheerfulness and hilarity, the puff-puff and infected ego underlay all. Positive that all eyes were upon him or her, positive that he or she was waiting in the great drama. The outcome was a thing for which untold millions waited with held breath. Such an ego might forbid certain lines of thought, though. These lines were predictable because they were all stretched in the same direction, from the unstable persons to object situations or other persons outside of the subject's field of control or fantasy. To the neurotic, there might be some difference, but to psychotic ones, they were one and the same. Annie Wilkes had wanted fast cars destroyed, and so, to her, there had only been one coffee. Maybe I could say the damn thing by telling her there were more. She would have seen that destroying the manuscript was futile. His breathing, which had been slow and toward sleep, suddenly caught on his throat, and his eyes widened. Yes, she would have seen it was futile. She would have been forced to acknowledge that one of those lines leading up to a place beyond her control. The ego would be hurting, squealing. I have such a temper. If she had been clearly faced with the fact that she couldn't destroy his dirty book, might not she have decided to destroy the creation of the dirty book instead? After all, there was no copy of Paul Sheldon. His heart was beating fast. In the other room, the clock began to bong, and he heard her thumping footfalls across the ceiling. The faint sound of her urinating. The toilet flushing, the heavy pad of her feet as she went back to bed, the creak of the springs. You won't make me mad again, will you? His mind suddenly tried to break into a gallop, an overbred trotter trying to break the circle. What, if anything, did all this dime store psychoanalysis mean in terms of his car? What about was found? What would it mean to him? Wait a minute, he whispered in the dark. Wait a minute, just hold the phone, slow down. He put his arm across his eyes again and tried to conjure up the state trooper with the dark sunglasses and the overlong sideburns. We found an overturned car down Humbuggy Mountain, the state trooper was saying, and blah, 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 blah-de-da. Only this time, Annie doesn't invite him to stay for coffee. This time she isn't going to feel safe until he's out of the house and far down the road. Even in the kitchen, even with two closed doors behind them in the guest room, even with the guest doped to the ears, the trooper might hear a groan. If the car was found, Annie Wilkes would know she was in trouble, wouldn't she? Yes, Paul whispered, his legs were burning to hurt again. But in the dawning horror of this recognition, he barely noticed. She would be in trouble not because she had taken to him, especially if he was close to Sidewinder, and so Paul believed to me, or that they would be giving her a medal and lifelong membership in the Misery Chastain fan club. To Paul's endless chagrin, there was actually such a thing. The problem was she had taken him to her house and installed him in the guest room and told no one. No phone call to the local ambulance service. This is Andy up on the Humbuggy Mountain Road, and I've got a fellow here. Looks a little bit like King Kong used him for a trampoline. The problem was she had filled him in full of dope, in which he was certainly not supposed to have access, not even if he was half as hooked as he thought he was. The problem was she had followed the dope with some sort of weird treatment, sticking IV needles in his arms, sprinting with legs with sawed-off pieces of aluminum crutches. The problem was Annie Wilkes had stand up there in Denver, and not as a supporting witness either, Paul thought. I bet the house and lot on that. So she watched the cop go down the road in his spandy clean cruiser, spandy clean except for the caked chunks of snow and salt nestled in the wheels and under the bumpers, that is. And she feels safe again, but not too safe because now she's like an animal with its wind up, way up. The cops will look and look and look, but because he is not just good old Joe Blow from Kokomo, he is Paul Sheldon, the literary associate from whose brow sprang Misery Chastain, darling of the dump-ins and sweethearts of the supermarkets. Maybe when they don't find him, they'll stop looking, or at least look someplace else. But maybe one of the roadie men saw her going by night and saw something funny in the back of the old Bessie. Something wrapped in a quilt. Something vaguely man-like. Even if they hadn't seen such a thing, she would have put it past the roadie men to make up a story to get in trouble if they didn't like her. The cops might come back. Next time in her house, guests might not be so quiet. He remembered her eyes darting around aimlessly when the fire in the barbecue was on the verge of getting out of control. He could see her tongue slicking her lips. He could see her walking back and forth, hands clenching and unclenching, picking every blow in the guest room where he lost his clout. Every now and then she would mutter, "Goodness," to the empty rooms. She had stolen a rare bird with beautiful feathers, a rare bird which came from Africa. And what would they do if they found out? Why, put her up on the stand again, of course. Put her up on the stand again in Devonport. And this she might not walk free. He took his arm away from his eyes. He looked at the interlocking W swing and drunk across the ceiling. He didn't need her elbow over his eyes to see the rest. She might hang up on him for a day or week. It might take a follow-up phone call or visit to make her side get of her rara arvis. But in the end, she would do it, just as the wild dogs began to bury their illicit kills after they'd been hunted a while. She would give him 5 pills instead of 2, or perhaps smother with him a pillow. Perhaps she would simply shoot him. There was rifles around here somewhere. Almost everyone living in the high country had one, and that would take care of the problem. No, not the gun. Too messy. Might leave evidence. None of that had happened yet because no one had found the car. They might be looking for him in New York or L.A., but no one was going to look for him in Sidewinder, Colorado. But in the spring, the W straggled across the ceiling, wiped, wasted. The throbbing in his legs was more insistent. The next time the clock bonged, she would come, but he was almost afraid she would read the thoughts on his face, like the bare premise of a story too gruesome to write. His eyes drifted left. There was a calendar on the wall. It showed a boy riding a sled down a hill. It was February according to the calendar, but if his calculations were right, it was already early March. Annie Wilkes had just forgotten to turn the page. How long before the melting snows revealed his Camaro with its New York plates and its registration in the glove compartment proclaiming the owner to be Paul Sheldon? How long before the trooper called her or until she read the paper? How long until the spring melt? 6 weeks? 5? This could be the length of my life, Paul thought, and began shuddering. Then his legs were fully awake, and it was not until she had come in and given him another dose of medicine that he was able to sleep. I'm going to end it right there. Thanks for listening.